Carlota McAllister is an anthropologist and associate professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York. She works on peasant struggles in Latin America, specifically Guatemala and Chile, using theoretical tools drawn from the anthropology of religion, actor network theory, feminist anthropology, and political ecology. Her book, The Good Road, A Quiche Revolutionary Theopolitics, is coming out this December with Duke University Press. I'm going to hand it over to Lakshmi. And you're muted, Lakshmi.
Hi, everybody. What I'm sharing today is one chapter of my yet to be finished dissertation. And it's one of three embodied practices that I discuss in my research. So I shall start with Aomori is the northernmost prefecture of Honshu Island and is the snowiest place on Earth. Siberian winds blow over the Hokkaido Mountains into Mutsu Bay, collecting moisture along the way and generating snow clouds that produce snowfalls averaging over 12 feet a year. The prefecture is also known for its mineral-rich hot springs or onsens. The oldest onsen in Japan, Sukayu, was founded over 300 years ago. It was discovered by hunters who found a wounded deer healing in the deep waters of the mountains in the south of Aomori City and called it Shika no Yu, or Deer Hot Spring, and became known eventually as Sukayu. Sukayu was the first onsen to be given the designation as a healing center by the Japanese government. The milky, densely mineral-rich water draws people from all over the world, as do other onsens in the prefecture. Hugged by Mutsu Bay, which separates Aomori Prefecture from the island of Hokkaido to the north, the Sea of Japan to the west, and the Pacific Ocean to the east, water has a significant presence in the land and in the residents' lives. The densely rich and diverse topography of mountains, bay, ocean, and forests epitomizes Tetsuri Watsuji's concept of and Aomori as a site of Fudo. Watsuji's Fudo is translated as climate, as the natural environment of a given land, its climate, its weather, the geological and productive nature of the soil, and its rich topographic features. Watsuji describes our environs as phenomenological, where we experience our world not in isolation, but as an element in the mutual relationship in climate. To consider Fudo as merely a natural environment is mistaken. It is the interconnectedness and co-constitutive nature of climate, the elements, land, and human existence, which he describes really beautifully in this passage, which I will skip to for time purposes. Watsuji wrote that thinking of climate after reading Heidegger's Being and Time and found that philosophy lacked the element of space and a climactic dimension, Fudo, as a primarily existential condition. I'd gone to Aomori to do an intensive training of an embodied practice, Noguchi Taiso, with Mari Osanai, a dancer and Noguchi Taiso practitioner, who's one of few living teachers who had studied directly with Noguchi and is also only one of two teachers who teaches it in English. Noguchi Taiso, where Taiso literally translates as gymnastics, is a form of bodywork developed by Michizo Noguchi in post-war Japan and over the course of half a century. His childhood on a silkworm farm in the countryside, his experience in the war of seeing the complete devastation of Tokyo's built environment, but where the land was still there, that left him in awe, and a chronic physical condition were the basis from which he developed his Taiso. Noguchi Taiso attunes to the weight and the fluidity of water within the body to determine movement. At the heart of Noguchi Taiso is to imagine the body as a living water bag, that our bodies are liquid and fluid with bones and organs floating in it and held within a thin membrane of skin. Noguchi had a great interest in the formulation, sound, and characteristics of Japanese words. He explored kanji, characters, as they related to the body, and he was also interested in the 46 Japanese sounds and their texture and meaning. A four-word phrase that he continued to repeat throughout his teaching career and that came from his linguistic explorations in embodied practice, makate, maite, makasete, and matsu, were terms that helped define a philosophy of this embodied practice. Essentially, Noguchi Taiso is a practice of yielding, giving in, and trusting and waiting. These words emerged out of his deep practice and exploration to exemplify the experiential quality of receptivity and attunement, specifically the surrendering and attunement to the flow of water and weight in the body, but more broadly to the natural world. He saw his Taiso as a kind of surrender to and a listening to the world within the body and the phenomenal world in contact with the body. In Japanese, not just characters, but sounds of characters also elicit nuance and meaning. Noguchi was interested in how these sounds and textures informed the body. Makate, maite, makasete, matsu all start with the sound ma. Ma, in both philosophical and aesthetic terms, is defined as a space, a pause, or gap. Unlike the Western understanding of space as a container or as a phenomena that separates things, Ma is understood as the space between, physically and temporally. Betweenness, or aidagara, is the core of Tetsuri Watsuji's ethics. For Watsuji, the locus of ethical problems lies not in isolated individual problems, but in the in-betweenness of person and person, and in an ecological context can be understood as a betweenness of human and more than human bodies, or between being and being. This betweenness implies a relationality, and for Watsuji, a being is always considered in relation to another. The foundation of Noguchi Taiso practice is to think that we are hanging from the earth, and through the weight of the water in our body, that we are connected to the center of the earth. Noguchi believed our literal physical connection with the earth is vital to our existence. He called this a conversation, an exchange, a listening to the earth. Doing Noguchi Taiso means to be in constant awareness of our contact with the earth. The weight of the water in our body connects us to the earth, and we watch and play with this weight, noticing how it shifts as we feel the water flow from one part of the body to another. In one practice, Mari suggested putting small water bags on the soles of my feet, gently pressing down on it. Retaining that feeling, I sensed each step that I took, and my contact with the earth had the quality of softness and buoyancy. Each step was a listening to and conversing with the earth as delicate and watery. This connection transformed my feeling of the most fundamental movement, walking. I sensed thought about the ground and my body both as water bags, as buoyant beings made up of the same elements in Ma. In another exercise, flower practice, and the practice is described here. Noguchi was encouraging an experience of the body as an extension of the earth as a plant, and the life cycle of a flower growing and dying and returning to the earth. It was an experiential connection to another body of water and how its waters flows, its birthing, and its extinguishing. Astrid Neimanis wrote that art is an amplifier. Experiencing this flower practice by letting go of my habitual body and surrendering to the plant's watery life cycles of birth and death amplified its expressiveness inside my body and also to the plants around me. Thinking of our being as conversing with the earth and with the water in our body and in our moving and through the world is determined by this conversation was the embodied knowledge that started to unfold by repeating these practices. After my first 2 days in Aomori with warm autumn weather, heavy rain started and lasted for several days. The rain became progressively heavier. I felt the weight of the water more pronounced in my body and the heaviness in the air. I had noticed how the trees, which were vibrant and airy when I first arrived, became laden and droopy with the heavy rain. The ground was drenched with water, and my feet sank as I stepped in the paths. The sound of the rain and the rushing streams that developed was a constant reminder of water taking over and transforming the landscape and my own feeling in my body. As the days progressed, moss started to grow on the concrete parts of the path around the property. Within a few days, the paths were dense with moss and a vibrant green started to flourish. It was so rapid, it was astonishing. Water was drenching, surrounding, and transforming the environment. As the landscape transformed, Noguchi Taiso opened my awareness to the interaction and transformation of body and land through water. This is nothing new. I had experienced and felt this many times, but the practice brought it to the forefront of my awareness in a profound and amplified way. It was Fudo embodied, and my attunement to it was cultivated by the practice. Embodied practice generates knowledge that can't be accessed in another way. Astrid Naimanis' Bodies of Water helps to formulate Noguchi Taiso for ecological thought beyond Watsuji's Fudo. Her feminist post-humanist phenomenological work, Bodies of Water, resonates with Noguchi's body as the living water bag. Her work concerns a central question in my research: how to rethink the body out of the contained, autonomous, and controlled subject into a relational being attuned to the natural world, and formulate this thinking for ecological thought. Practicing Noguchi Taiso as a watery being, we yield and listen to the flow and weight inside the body. Naimanis' focus is on the material aspect of this water that asks us to imagine our body of water as part of a hydrocommons. We expel, we drink, we swim. There is a continual exchange of our body of water with other bodies of water, which untangles us from the discrete individualism so that we can think of ourselves as anything other than more than human. We rely on other bodies of water that in turn rely on others, and in this way, we are wholly interconnected. Extending our thinking of our bodies as water is to think about how we might also relate to other bodies, an attunement that Naimanis writes can open to an empathy for other bodies of water. If we consider all the bodies of water that are polluted and laden with plastics, with Naimanis' concept of hydrocarbons, it's not difficult to imagine an empathetic response. One of the water at one of the onsens I visited in Aomori was Kuroyu, translated as black water, hot spring. Kuroyu, I was told, is rich in humic acid formed by the decay of plant and animal matter, a process that takes thousands of years. The deposits deep in the earth mix with the water table and emerge in hot springs that are found mostly in that region of Japan. As I soaked in this water, my porous, watery body mixing with the history of the life of trees, animals, plants, and earth from thousands of years back, I was reminded of the hydrocommons, Fudo, and the practices. It stirred a deep resonance of the interconnectedness and cycles of which I'm a part. I found myself thinking about the flower exercise and about how deforestation does not allow a tree to live its full life cycle and death cycle, and how this amazing substance, kuroyu, will not exist in our continued extractive, expansionist attitude toward the earth, and also diminish the rich, profound relationality we share. Noguchi, through his practice of water and weight and his philosophy of Taiso, of surrendering, letting go, yielding, waiting, and relationality, sheds the contained, controlling, and autonomous self, and affirms that we have already, always have been interrelational and interconnected. And as a side note, I've used attunement and noticing throughout this presentation, but as I write, I feel it's not really what the practices are revealing. Attunement is stained with the notion of a separation, one observing another. And what I'm finding is that through the practice and by rethinking the body out of the habit of separation or fixed notions, in the case of Noguchi Taiso as a bag of water, dissolves this discreteness, and what it reveals is a lived experience of a porous body in its relationality and interconnectedness. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really lovely, Lakshmi. I'll turn it over to Rachel now.
Can you both hear me and see me? I can see the slides, but I can't see. Maybe they can't hear me. Hang on. Do I need to share my screen? Is that what I need to do?
You do.
Yeah, sorry. Bit of a Luddite.
That's fine. Okay, sorry. Okay, see sharing bit is the bit.
Ah, from Zoom, not from there.
Yes, there we are.
Perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. So the work thank you so much to the organisers, both here in Bristol and over in York. The work I'm going to be presenting today is part of my current book project, Marine Attachments, which examines marine life, so particularly invertebrates and fish, and ideas of attachment in modern and contemporary poetry. I'm particularly interested in poetry as a space where it might be possible to discover and reflect on affective responses to marine life that go against the grain or perhaps against the tide of mainstream cultural attitudes and feelings. So affective responses which often seem strange and inexplicable, not least to the poets themselves. Today, I'll be focusing on the fourth of my 5 poets, Ed Robeson. So I'm just seeing how I can, okay, who some of you may know. And if you don't, I'm very pleased to be introducing some of Robeson's work to you today. In February of 1968, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette featured an article about an unusual employee at the recently opened Pittsburgh Aqua Zoo, which was then the second largest aquarium in the United States. Entitled "Local Poet Man's Tank at Aqua Zoo," the article describes how the then 28-year-old Ed Robeson had taken the job, quote, feeding and caring for the aquarium animals in order to supplement his income alongside his writing and community college teaching. The author of the article goes on to state that Robeson's, quote, diversified life is not as incongruous as it might sound, end quote, referencing his previous experience as a research assistant in a biology lab, before concluding that, quote, fish are his work, but poetry is his life. The article appears eager to smooth over the incongruities of the poet swimming with dolphins and eels and marking essays on Eliot and Yeats, establishing a clear separation between life and work, fish and poetry. Robeson, however, seems less willing to make this distinction, informing the interviewer quietly amid the bubbling sound of the tanks that his creative process involves, quote, writing from where I am today, before adding, I find poetry in my work. Robeson's response to the animals in his care is also pleasingly off-kilter. You become sympathetic to some of their reactions, he tells the interviewer, and you get favorites like mine, the arapaima of South America. It looks like a miniature dirigible, sleek, smooth, with a metal colour. Robeson is referring to one of the Pittsburgh Aquazoo's then largest residents, the Arapaima gigas, an ancient freshwater fish that can grow up to 3 meters long. This enormous fish would remain one of Robeson's most loved aquarium charges. More than half a century later, he would reflect in a poem on the lasting affection that he formed towards the Arapaima after it tried to eat him. Significantly, though, Robeson makes little attempt to communicate his affection for the Arapaima in a way that would generate fellow feeling for it. There's something curiously opaque about his description of a body that is, quote, sleek, smooth, with a metal colour. The eye cannot help but slide off of it. The poet's shift from an expression of fondness to an image of something akin to a military airship presents a baffling non sequitur. One might expect a but to follow this statement, in which Robeson outlines some of the fish's more redeeming features, but the article ends here. Now, I think Robeson's oblique description of the Arapaima is indicative of a wider tendency in his aquarium poetry, which expresses a powerful affection towards the aquatic animals in his care without seeming to want to elicit a shared response from the reader or to render these feelings particularly legible. Robeson's refusal to give a satisfactory account of his marine attachment can be situated within the wider context of the aquarium as a commercial structure that seeks to foster a collective and often limited set of feelings towards aquatic species. Like the SeaWorld experience described by Susan Davis in Spectacular Nature, aquariums, quote, are in the feelings business. They have to generate feelings of excitement and interest and avoid boredom, uneasiness, anxiety, disgust, and pity, end quote. Another way of thinking about the aquarium is as a structure that requires what Edouard Glissant characterizes in the Poetics of Relation in relation to Western thought as a form of transparency, which reduces life to what can be seen and what can be grasped. Transparency is, for Glissant, quote, a gesture of enclosure, if not appropriation. Against this, Glissant argues for, quote, the right to opacity, which in his eyes would be the real foundation of relation in freedoms. So Robeson's unusual response to the animals in his care pushes back against the aquarium's narrow frame of feeling and demand for transparent relations. Robeson's work presents the subject's affective response to aquatic species as something highly individual and non-fungible, to recall the philosopher of emotion, Ronald de Souza, and therefore at odds with the aquarium's dominant structuring of emotional and affective relations. It also emphasizes the importance of being able to express one's own particular relations in one's own particular ways. And this emphasis has particular implications for a poet who has sought to develop what Kevin Quashie has elsewhere described as a form of, quote, black expressiveness without publicness as its forebearer. A quiet mode of resistance which privileges what Quashie calls the whimsy of the interior. This paper will focus on Robeson's 2022 sequence of poems, Aquarium Works, in which he returns more than half a century later to his time spent feeding and caring for the animals at the Pittsburgh Aquazoo, reflecting on his unique experiences as a tank diver and written in his singular experimental style, consisting of what Nathaniel Mackey calls syntactically double-jointed syntax and grammar that seeks to say something in something else. These poems express an often obscure and idiosyncratic bond with aquatic species. Turning away from the aquarium's logic of total visibility and affective uniformity, these poems make room for a more unscripted set of feelings to emerge. As Jane Desmond and others have noted, the public aquarium also has deep roots in imperialism and nation building. And Robeson's aquarium sequence often relates the uncomfortable sensation of being, quote, invisibly at work on public display, end quote, as a black tank diver for the aquazoo's predominantly white audience in the late 1960s, some of whom are pictured here in a photo from the aquazoo's opening in 1967. You always wonder if they are laughing at you, not a porpoise, reflects Robeson's speaker at one point while training the dolphins. In order to avoid the sensation of being a source of public entertainment, Robeson opted to work the quieter night shifts, tending to the animals after the crowds had left. And it was in the after hours, outside of the glare of the public eye, that Robeson was able to develop what he characterized as, quote, a real relationship, end quote, with the animals in his care. I felt kind of linked to what they needed, he would later reflect in a conversation with fellow poet Lynn Aginian. There's something suggestive yet slightly cryptic about the phrase, what they needed. Here, as in the poems themselves, there's a certain inwardness and opacity, if you will, to Robeson's expressions of real relation with these animals, which leaves us as readers feeling only partly privy to a bond that is developing somewhere out of view. So to give an example of this, pair of sonnets that feature midway through Aquarium works that center around a series of encounters with a rare form of primitive lungfish. So the first of these two sonnets, entitled Love Sickness, recounts the tankman's discovery during one late shift of, quote, a red thing hanging out of one of the tank filters. Initially wary of the danger that this mysterious growth could pose to the other inhabitants of the tank, the speakers then moved to discover that it is in fact an incredibly rare species of primitive lungfish that has somehow made its way over with the other species collected, or rather extracted, from the Amazon for the aquazoo. Often the full reality of where what has arrived from is an immigrant, love of the widened country, tears widen, open your eyes. In this moment, the tank expands somewhat allegorically to represent the borders of the nation, the lungfish resembling a vulnerable migrant from elsewhere. Yet what's most striking, for me at least, is the final turn back from this widened frame of reference in the closing moments of this poem here to a much narrower form of self-address in the oblique image of your eyes widened by tears. There's something deeply moving about these final lines, even as they seem to be contracting and turning inwards or even away from us towards the whimsy of the interior, to recall Quashie. And one reason for this, I think, is that these poems frequently address themselves to an unspecified you, who it seems, to recall another poem in the sequence, is maybe also me. In a study of lyric apostrophe, William Waters surmises that when a poem seems to be turning away from its readers to address a specific or even named referent that is clearly not the reader, the you restlessly tugs at us, begging identification. And the more directly identifiable and private this mode of second-person address appears to be, the more intensely the reader may feel this pull. Robeson's apostrophic and private you likewise insinuates us into a bond, even as it shuts us out of one, engaging our sympathies at the very moment when the speaker's pronouncements appear most insular and self-directed. In the next sonnet in the sequence, St. James Infirmary, Robeson describes discovering the lungfish, quote, dried out on the floor during another shift, apparently dead. Dropping its desiccated body absent-mindedly back into the tank for safekeeping, the speaker returns later on to discover its Lazarus-like rebirth in the water. While the speaker knows, based on his scientific background, that this species of lungfish can in fact rehydrate to life from a state of estivation or dormancy, to the layman, the feeling of its revival is overwhelming for the speaker. I'd read, but shit, here was my baby, out talking my literacy, live script. There's an unfiltered immediacy to these lines, achieved in part through the deixis of here, as well as the expletive but shit that cuts across the academic register with its live script. Again, there's a sense that we're witnessing an essentially private or opaque moment of relation here, with the speaker's term of endearment for the lungfish, my baby, calling to mind not only kind of paternal affection, but also potentially the terms of address for a lover. Now, this hint of romance is further suggested by the title of the poem, which shares its name with the blues song popularized by Louis Armstrong in 1928. I went down to the St. James Infirmary, sings Armstrong mournfully, found my baby there, stretched out on a long white table, so sweet, so cold, so fair. So the connection being implied here in Robeson's poem between the loss of an intimate loved one and the death and rebirth of an obscure species of aquatic animal that the speaker had initially mistaken for a leather scab lying on the floor might at first seem effectively jarring. Yet we might make sense of this by turning to remarks that Robeson made elsewhere about the influence of the blues tradition on his writing. And just a content warning here, that this quotation contains reference to racial and sexual violence. For a long time, this is Robeson speaking in an interview, for a long time you'd hear about somebody being raped or beaten and killed, and you'd ask your mother, what is rape? Oh, nothing, go away. So history for a while is just that working underneath feeling. You know something is riding you, but you don't know what that mechanism is that's moving stuff. To get that in is as important as getting the fact in. So this passage, I think, offers an important reminder of the wider social and political histories that are working underneath Robeson's aquarium sequence. So the freight of the Middle Passage that's referenced elsewhere, the ongoing legacies of colonialism and white supremacy at the aquarium. But what's key here is that this working underneath feeling is not attached to any specific subject or form of knowledge, remaining instead an unknowable something that is riding you, but you don't know what that mechanism is. In the final part of St. James Infirmary, after discovering the lungfish rehydrated to life, the speaker expresses a similar sentiment to the one seen here. Often, even if you read in plain language, you don't understand what is going to engage your life. And this, for me, is perhaps the clearest indication of what I'm calling attachment, or the mechanism that's moving stuff in Robeson's writing. Like the speaker, we cannot experience it by reading about its objects of interest, such as a lungfish, in plain language or in a straightforwardly descriptive account. Robeson's marine attachments cannot be pinpointed to the aquatic subjects themselves or the words that are being used to describe them. Instead, the poem's affective energy tends to surface at moments where a descriptive impulse breaks down. In the gaps and pauses in these lines, their jarring shifts in tone and register, as well as in their apostrophic asides, all of which make room for that working underneath feeling. So it's the moments in these aquarium poems that seem the most inward-looking and opaque, speaking only to themselves, that present the most powerfully involving expressions of attachment. Robeson's use of second-person address forms part of a wider tendency in aquarium works, which fosters intimacy with the other, the reader included, at the same time as it preserves a vital sense of distinction and set-apartness. Throughout the sequence, the slipperiness of the lyrical you maintains a form of referential uncertainty that leaves space for a more individualized response. And the aquarium sequence makes room for this response by insisting on the having of preferences, so the speaker's preferences, while not restricting readers to a world of singular or normative responses. So to conclude, reflecting on his time at the aquarium, Robeson tells a story about how he and his co-workers would sometimes sing and make funny noises from behind the tanks to see how visitors to the aquarium would react. You couldn't see us, Robeson explains, but you could hear us. And he describes this in one of his poems as well. This anecdote calls to mind John Stuart Mill's account of lyric poetry as a form of address that is designed to be overheard rather than heard. It also implies an extra level of sonic trickery and playful obstructiveness in the positioning of the reader as an outsider to these aquarium poems, overhearing something going on behind the glass. So it's hinted at obliquely in the opening poem in the sequence of aquarium works from which the title of this paper comes. I hear a singing on the other side of a door, singing going on behind the tanks, heard on the public floor, people invisibly at work, on public display, their aquarium. Like an aquarium goer hearing songs and laughter from behind the scenes, we're presented in lieu of an overly lit public spectacle with the muffled music of a private bond. Both the human and the non-human worker in these poems, and Robeson frequently insists that the animals too are workers, non-human workers, both appear to a certain extent protected from public scrutiny amid the interiority, formal and linguistic, of these poems. The speaker's cryptic assertions and odd forms of self-address seem designed both to express and preserve the sanctity of a more idiosyncratic attachment to the creatures in his care, which occurs without an established or generalizable frame of reference. In this way, Robeson's aquarium works devises a way of resisting the prevailing affective and socio-political atmosphere of the aquarium and of sounding out a private space of relation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was what an interesting presentation. I love that idea of overhearing rather than hearing. Carlota.
Yes, I'm going to try to share. Am I sharing? Yes. Okay. Continue to share. Here we go. Thank you so much to the organizers of this fantastic series and of this panel specifically for inviting me to participate in it. And thank you so much to my fellow presenters for your fascinating presentations. I'm excited to continue this conversation. Today, I'm going to talk not about water in a sort of general sense, but specifically about rivers. How can we take rivers as a site to think about the earth as a sovereign body rather than a body over which sovereignty is exercised? Conceit of this talk. Sorry, I went ahead of myself. I come to this question through a specific river, the Baker, which is spelled Baker, Chile's mightiest waterway, and this is the Baker that you see here. I encountered this river thanks to a dam project called Hidro Aysén, which proposed to build 5 hydroelectric megadams on the Baker and another wild river, the Pascua, in the very sparsely populated Aysén region of Chilean Patagonia. What originally interested me about this as a site to work in was the question of whether and how the people who lived where the dams were supposed to be built would end up mobilizing against it. So I was interested in kind of questions of environmental politics. This seemed like an interesting question, especially at that time, because these people who mostly live in a town called Cochrane, or Cochrane, as you would see spelled Cochrane, that is several hundred kilometers from any other large human settlement, are gauchos. This means a lot of things, but one big thing it means was that they were interpolated by anti-dam environmental activists as hostile to the kinds of environmental concerns that are sort of normally imagined to motivate activism against extractive industry. For one thing, herding sheep and cattle, which is the fundamental economic activity of gauchos, can be very damaging to native ecosystems, especially when practiced on a large scale and when native forest has to be cleared, which is what happened in Aysén. About 3 or 4 million hectares of trees were burned at an earlier stage of its settlement. For another thing, gauchos are big fans of capitalism, or at least of private property, and there's some slippage between those things, possession of which they enjoy in the form of both land and animals. And in this attachment to capitalism, they tend to imagine themselves as operating as a kind of homo economicus, and think of nature as an externality, at least some of the time. So they weren't obvious environmental subjects, let's say, but they did end up mobilizing. In 2012, the whole region of Aysén rose up and blockaded all major points of entry to the region. There's only 3 big ones. It's very remote, as I said, and held these barricades for 3 weeks despite a very fierce show of force from the Chilean police. The uprising started in Puerto Aysén, which is in the north, and moved throughout the whole region. So eventually, not just the ports of entry, but smaller roads within the region were blocked, basically to prevent the entry of anything imported, gas, food, etc., and police to some degree. This is the blockade in Cochrane. And it was a very powerful display of control over this space, and ultimately a successful one. So unlike most stories about dam projects, Hydroaicén was canceled in 2014 after it became such a huge liability for the Chilean state that it was seen as inviable as a project. So, and specifically Michelle Bachelet, who was initially a supporter of the dams, eventually canceled the project when she returned to the presidency, campaigning in part on the cancellation of the dams. But I would argue, and I have argued, that there's a kind of equivocation between Bachelet's decision and the reasons that she might have thought she was making this decision to cancel the dams, and a reading of something like this uprising, and the drivers of the uprising itself. What joined the protesters participating in the uprising was their territorial sense of aggrievement and their affirmation of their identity as Patagonians against the central Chilean government, whether or not they'd taken a stand on Hydroaicén. So here it says, if you're a true-born Patagonian, join the struggle, Cochrane. Patagonia, of course, is the southernmost part of the Americas, shared by the nation states of Argentina and Chile. Patagonians themselves do not treat the border as a question of much interest. People will say things like, "I just put my blanket over the fence and jump over it." They're quite dismissive of the phenomenon of the border. But in fact, it's one of the more conflictual borders in South America, nearly becoming the site of war between Chile and Argentina at several points in the 19th and 20th centuries. So for the protesters to claim this territory as Patagones, as true-born Patagonians, was not just threatening to the Chilean state in the sense that it challenged its right over this territory, but also because it raised the specter of its historic enemy, Argentina, in entering into its territory, something that the protesters themselves would often raise they would carry Argentine flags or say, threaten to raise Argentine flags and make other kinds of gestures towards the non-existence of this border. I've been thinking through this equivocation between the specific conjuncture of the Hydroaicén conflict and the larger question of what it means to defend Patagonia, and thinking through the role of the more than human powers of the Baca River itself in stopping its own damming. And that's how we might frame environmental politics as a sort of more than human endeavor. I'm not going to rehearse all my arguments here, but I'll just emphasize the sort of powers of the Bacar. It's an extraordinarily powerful landscape-defining river, and part of a very large and significant watershed, also very landscape-defining, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And the ways that Cochrane's gauchos and other Ayseninos reckon with the telluric powers of this waterscape endow it with considerable political force. What I want to think about here is how these powers, its telluric powers, emerge from the Patagonian space in which Cochraninos and other Ayseninos mobilized over a longer durée than that of the dam conflict or even of the formation of the Chilean state itself. What kind of space, in other words, is being claimed when you claim allegiance to Patagonia? Okay, so for a long time, Patagonia was both a very geopolitically important site in one sense and terra nullius in another. So it's the Strait of Magellan over here, and we've been learning a lot about how important straits are for geopolitics recently. It was a very important sort of site of imperial interest, particularly for the British, etc. But the inland part of Patagonia was almost unknown to these various imperial powers fighting over this space, this oceanic space. The interior remained more or less unknown, unexplored, et cetera, until the late 19th century when both the Chilean and the Argentine states started to push southwards. So In Chile, this starts happening in, it's more or less the 1880s for both of them. On Chile, the Mapuche kingdom gets conquered, incorporated into the Chilean state. In Argentina, it's called the War of the Desert, and basically they went massacring south to take over the space. So then the problem of the interior of Patagonia started to also be a geopolitical question. This was initially resolved through an 1856 treaty, which rested on certain certain agreements made in 1810 without a lot of concreteness about where to share this territory. Uti possedeti juris of 1810, but which had to do with taking possession of the space, but no one had actually really taken possession of it yet. So when they turned to thinking about who Patagonia belonged to, happened in more or less again, in 1881 is when this question gets decided. Thanks to the British retain significant imperial interests in this region, and the British map the border between Chile and Argentina and determine that it will run, and I'm reading out here, the boundary line shall run in that extent over the highest summits of the said cordilleras, the mountains, which divide the waters, and shall pass between the sources of streams flowing down to other side. So this line gets traced through the mountain tops, dividing essentially so that the waters that run, the headwaters of waters that run to the Atlantic belong to Argentina, and the ones that run to the Pacific belong to Chile. This is the determination. It's called the divisadero, this division line. It's very important in Patagonian politics. And it speaks to the broader role of waters often in determining borders. So often rivers themselves become borders. They're conveniently lineal, apparently. And this is a sort of more complicated formation, but the rivers themselves are seen as defining natural borders between these geopolitical constructs. But the question is, and the British did do quite a bit of hiking around and exploring, which is partly why all the names of these places are in English. But there's a problem at the heart of this decision, which is that some of the waters that empty into the Atlantic, it turns out, with more explanation, have their headwaters on the other side of the mountain peaks where they'd originally run this line. And so there was a sort of certain amount of sorting out of this kind of question because headwaters turned out not to match the tops of the mountains, which people thought they would. More importantly, there is, over time, the question of what waters run to the Atlantic and run to the Pacific have changed dramatically over the last 25,000 years, and presumably much longer than that. Over the last 25,000 years, these headwaters have shifted back and forth often between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And specifically, there was a giant event 5,000 years ago that hydrologists and geologists have studied. There was a massive lake. There used to be a lake, the Lake Chacabuco, the sort of ancient Lake Chacabuco, that covered almost all of this territory. And through a phenomenon known as the glacial lake overflow phenomenon, about 5,000 years, it opened up and ran through the Baker, dumped almost all of the water of this ancient lake out into the Pacific Ocean, totally transforming the entire landscape at that time. And you can still see sort of scars from this. Imagine a whole lake emptying out in the space of days or weeks. There's these very distinct scars on the mountains where you can see this activity, the register of this activity. So the point is here, this is not a landscape on which you might want to fix your geopolitics. It's a changeable landscape. There has been in geography and political ecology a movement to think about river basins and other so-called hydrosocial territories in this way that I'm not sure if you can see the whole thing here, but let me move my spatial configurations of people, institutions, water flows, hydraulic technology, and the biophysical environment that revolve around the control of water, and to define territorial politics on the basis of these territories, these hydrosocial territories. This idea recognizes the political and territorial configurations of things like watersheds or these headwaters and so on and so forth beyond their captures by specific states, and aims to endow these entities with a certain amount of political reality. But phrases like control of water still assume that what is required for a political body that includes water, even when it does include water, is its appropriate representation and the conversion of this representation into subjecthood by a sovereign power that is ultimately exercised by humans. And one of the many things it doesn't tell us is how that sovereign power is to be constituted. It assumes the process of its constitution in advance. And what the shifting waters of the Patagonian borderlands should tell us is that all the artifacts that constitute the state by anchoring its powers in a particular territory, and that is ultimately how states exercise their power, maps, measurements, etc., are not just artificial and thus subject to critique in the sense that they depend on human histories and cultures and blah, 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 but also that they rest on the false assumption that any final or decisive anchoring is truly possible in an earth that is constantly in flux. So water and rivers are one of the places where we can perceive this impossibility of anchoring. In his study of the Ganges River, Dilip d'Acunha, and this is a fantastic book called The Invention of Rivers that I recommend everyone read, argues that the river itself is a fundamental conceit of power, and he traces this all the way back to Alexander the Great. The conceit of power is that rivers are lines on the land. That involves drawing a line between land and water on the Earth's surface. And as he says here, this involves a choice of time when water is not moving, precipitating, seeping, soaking air, soil, and vegetation, collecting in interstices, pores, evaporating, and transpiring in ways that defy delineation. So the world has cast anchor in this moment, this moment of water as it forms visibly on the Earth's surface, making at the time of reality when an Earth's surface can be seen and articulated with some clarity. He argues that rivers are instead watery three-dimensional entities, and he notes that in the case of the Ganges, it's actually the goddess Ganga. So the river Ganges is this three-dimensional watery entity that is actually the goddess Ganga, not a river in the way that we conceive of it. So I take this as very provocative and interesting, this kind of goddessly totality that is constituted by movement and flow and all these watery forms of movement, et cetera, et cetera. But while this is easier to see perhaps in the case of water, and water may be taking the lead here, I think what it's showing us is that the Earth itself is constituted by these kinds of properties. I said earlier that the Bakr had telluric powers, and telluric, of course, means of the Earth, which once again would seem like an anchoring concept, and this plays to a whole discussion that we've probably had and can continue to have about the Earth being conceived as fixed, while water is conceived of as in movement. But the Earth, the telluric also refers to a phenomenon known as the telluric current, which is, I've got my slides backwards, a naturally occurring electrical current which flows at or near the Earth's surface over very large areas. At any point from which it is observed, it constantly changes direction and magnitude. So this is also a property of the Earth, this flow, this changing of direction and magnitude, et cetera, et cetera. The Earth itself is flowing. And there's a lot of, I've just sort of discovered this, so I'm very excited about this concept, but it leads to all kinds of interesting thoughts. The constantly changing properties of rivers is because they are of the Earth, not because they are the exception to it, in short. So what if we took the telluric and its constantly changing flows as a provocation to reimagine sovereignty? In the contemporary world system, as we know, sovereignty is imagined as the decision on the exception. This is Carl Schmitt's formulation, but he's drawing here on people like Hobbes from, this is this famous frontispiece of the Leviathan. The sovereign is constituted outside and very much above the forms of life over which he rules on the model of the Abrahamic God bestowing miracles. But what if the decision decider and the exception cannot be separated? What if Ganga, both river and goddess, is a better figuration of sovereignty? Or the Bakr itself, this is another photo of the Bakr, which likes to regularly change direction, magnitude, and so on and so forth, as you see here. So this is an overflowing of the fixed bridge of human sovereignty, one might say. what kinds of political bodies would such a vision of sovereignty animate? And what would it mean for subjects who are, for humans who are subjects of such a sovereign? Okay, I'm not sure how much time I have left. I think I have a bit of time. Essentially, I want to argue that that Ayseninos are subjects of this rivery sovereign, and that their ways of thinking about borders and movement across their territory are indicative of their subjectivity in this sense. So these are the current borders of the region of Aysén, and as you'll see, they're almost all rivers. So movement across it's not all of them, but almost all of them are rivers one way or another. It's a very rivery terrain. And people have historically moved across them not just by putting their blankets over the fence and jumping over, but by moving along these rivery waterways. And this has been a phenomenon. The whole phenomenon of the settlement of Aysén has to do with these movements back and forth, transgressing various kinds of nation state strictures. Aysén was settled in two different processes, one through the ocean and one through the land. After the conquest of the Mapuche kingdom, a lot of displaced Mapuches and also Chilean peasants from the north came through Argentina and spent about 30 years wandering literally in the desert, moving south in Argentina along with the cattle and sheep frontiers, and eventually crossed back into Chile on the invitation of the Chilean state. But there's a number of processes that happen sort of politically during that. They are subjects with no representation, essentially, while they're in Argentina during this long kind of wandering period. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but this is a huge political problem in the late 19th century and the early 20th century between these two countries is this large wandering population of extremely poor and very marginal Chileans in this part of the country. And another interesting aspect of this is that in the 1920s in Argentina, there was a period of anarchist organizing on the estancias, the sheep farms of Argentina, which eventually led to these, and it's very hard to organize people in an estancia, I could talk more about that, but led to these massive mobilizations of people on the estancias, almost all of whom were Chileans, and ended up facing massacres by the Argentine state. So there's a big, this idea of rebel Patagonia, La Patagonia Rebelde, was faced by this giant massacre. So probably about 5,000 of these workers were killed in the 1920s, again, almost all Chileans. So this space is characterized from a much earlier state by a kind of anarchic mode of doing politics, by a commitment to movement over fixity, et cetera, et cetera. And this remains the way that people understand themselves as moving through this space. So the common figure, a common figure in terms of how people talk about living in this space is the idea of arrancando, escaping. So you can always leave, and usually through a watery way, as this guy, Aquiles, is doing here in his rowboat on the Bacard. This idea of arrancando represents an attachment to a territory that is not constituted by its fixity, but rather by its possibilities of escape. Okay, I'm happy to talk more about any of these details, but thank you so much in the meantime.
Thank you very much, Carlota. Lakshmi, if you wanted to turn your camera back on, and Rachel. Such wonderfully rich presentations. We have about half an hour for discussion and conversation. I'd like to start by asking the panelists if they have any questions for each other. I certainly could see some really interesting parallels between the different ideas and presentations, the different, very similar and different conceptions of water. And I'd love to know if your presentation sparked thoughts in each other first. And those of you who are online, you're welcome to type your questions into the Q&A.
I have
Carlota.
I have a question, which is more about fish than about water, really. I'm thinking about, I was thinking as you were, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name, Sarah. What?
Rachel?
Rachel, sorry, excuse me. Um, I was thinking as you were talking about a conversation that I saw between John Law and Donna Haraway, in which Donna Haraway was in her kind of species regard moment. So you're staring into the eyes of your dog or whatever. And John Law, who was working on fish farms at the time, said to her, he was like, Donna, you cannot stare into the eyes of a fish, like especially in a fish farm. It's you barely see them. They're sort of always slipping away and they're kind of out of reach and all of these things. Um, and the kind of challenge of that to the then sort of model of what multi-species relations were like. And I really thought about that in your talk about that, the ways that these sort of this the and you discussed it so beautifully, the kind of unapproachability, the machine-like or metallic nature of these creatures, the leather-like, the textures and all these things really does challenge our modes of empathy or of thinking of these sort of through a question of empathy. Or anyways, this is more of a comment, but I love that. I thought it was so beautifully illustrated in this, and I wondered if you've had any more reflections on that kind of the refusal that that offers to certain models of respect, regard, empathy, all of those kinds of things among humans and more than humans.
Yeah, thank you so much for that thought and kind of question, I guess, as well, which really it's really helpful for my own thinking. I'm sort of trying to draft the introduction to the book project at the moment, so it's really helpful to kind of think about this idea of like, looking into the eyes of a fish, or this idea of the kind of returned gaze, which is such a big thing in animal studies, this idea of, encounter being a kind of involving a kind of reciprocity of sorts and a form of recognition. And I think that's partly why I've been quite drawn to the concept or a concept of attachment, because I think it's quite a tricky and in a way quite slippery, or can be quite a slippery concept, in the sense that you can very much be attached to something that doesn't love you back, if you see what I mean. That it doesn't need to be a reciprocal relation, that you can develop these kind of powerful bonds in a way that feels kind of one way, and I think I've been looking for years for kind of ways of thinking about relationality in relation to fish and marine invertebrates in particular, because they seem to be, at the kind of outer limits of our ability to relate. And I'm sure there are other examples of this as well, but thinking about the kind of vastness of marine biodiversity and marine ecology, and this sense of, what does it mean to try and be in relation to something like a jellyfish or a school of jellyfish, ideas of the individual versus this kind of sense of multiplicity or a lack of individuality. And I think thinking about this through the work of individual poets that have kind of gradually emerged over the course of this has been really helpful in thinking about almost these kind of exception cases, like obviously Robeson working in an aquarium day to day with animals and developing these kind of real relationships, as he calls them. Highly unusual, right? It's not something that most of us would ever have any kind of access to. And then the kind of specialist knowledge he has, being trained as a scientist while also being a poet and, kind of teacher of English literature as well. It's creates this kind of unique vantage point and skill set. And all these other kind of factors of his background and the time period, the late 1960s, race and kind of ideas of colonialism and imperialism at the aquarium. So I think, I'm always quite drawn to things that feel quite tricky and quite sort of difficult. And so I think that's a really helpful discussion. Do you know if that conversation that they had was published in any form, or was it purely a sort of exchange in the moment?
It was just, they were at a keynotes at a conference, so I don't
see.
think it has been, but yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, unmute. Dana, please go ahead and unmute yourself.
maybe they can't unmute them. Oh, there.
Okay, I shall ask your question for you.
No, it's okay. Someone
Oh,
just
great.
gave me the power.
Brilliant.
Thanks, everybody. I really liked all of these papers, and my question was for Carlotta, and I'm interested in this idea about the hydrosocial territories and whether they also are based on the idea of like a watershed as a boundary in, I guess, would then be subject to the same kind of difficulties or critiques that you made about the idea of a watershed not being a sort of having a fixed boundary. And I've been working with some of the land defenders on the Ottawapiskat River up north that are concerned about the Ring of Fire infrastructure projects. And we've been working a little bit with Anishinaabe conceptions of territory, which also have this kind of multiplicity to it and resist the idea of sort of a fixed or exclusive boundary. So I'm just curious about this concept, if you can say any more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that concept of the hydrosocial terror, I mean, it's very productive in that way, in that um, it acknowledges the facts of how water moves and how water connects people and the ways that people form ecological relationships to water and all those things. But I think ultimately my critique is that it begs the question of governance and thus of sovereignty. So how it doesn't solve, it sort of begs the question that it aims to solve, which is, how do we decide what happens in this space? Removing the geopolitical borders doesn't actually solve that question, I would argue, because it continues to presume a certain idea about human governance, which I imagine, I think that these much richer concepts of territory, which are sometimes more formalized. I mean, I think the sort of goddessliness of the Ganges is, for me, an important way of thinking about that. It's three-dimensional, not just in the sort of the fact that there's a hydrological cycle that moves up and down and all these kinds of things, but it speaks to these other dimensions, invisible dimensions, to talk about the invisible again, and so on and so forth, as dimensions of governance. And I think often, and you know more about this than I do, indigenous ideas about water governance participate in this kind of way of thinking in North America and other places as well. But yeah, so I think it poses an interesting question, but it doesn't, it begs that same question in its formulation, in the sense that it sees territory as subject to control rather than the agent of control, or the subject of control, subject to rather than subject of. If that makes sense. So
Amazing. Yes, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, I'll ask one of Lakshmi. Lakshmi, you started to talk about your dissatisfaction with the idea of attunement, with and the way in which you see that it sort of that even the idea of attunement perpetuates an idea, a subject-object distinction, the being toward which one is attuned, which is not unrelated to Carlotta's question about sort of taking apart Haraway's understanding of the gaze as a facing. But I wonder if you could possibly elaborate a little bit more about what you see Noguchi Taiso as a practice cultivating that isn't attunement. How would you begin? And here we have the problem of language, which you and I have talked about many times. But how might you begin to describe the affect of the practice, that in a way that is not making ecological consciousness, and that is not based on the idea of cultivating attunement?
Yeah, I'm still struggling with that. It's something that just sort of started coming out in my writing. And I mean, my work is very practice-based research. And so much of what came out, like I didn't go to Aomori with Noguchi, with Watsuji's theory in mind or anything. It's just all came out of sort of this embodied knowledge, I would call it. So specifically, and this is something that has actually come up in all three of the different practices that I've worked with, is this idea that just deeply involved in the practice itself as an affective like the body as an affective register, is actually what's happening is it's sort of revealing or uncovering the sense of like porosity and the non-boundedness of our bodies in its relation with all the phenomenological world. So when I use the term attunement, it already sets up a sense of separateness. So, or even sort of noticing, for example. So it's true, language is difficult. I haven't found the word for it, but I guess maybe affect and affective registers is probably the closest I could get to it. And the sense of an embodied knowledge, embodied experience, which is something it's been very difficult to write about, because I'm doing it through the body and like finding language that is experienced through the body. So, and it's something that I feel is a kind of not like a sense and knowledge that's difficult to come to in any other way than through the body's physical experience of doing a practice. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
I think it's certainly, I mean, I was struck by the relationship between the way in which in the poetry, Rachel, the spaces were so critical to the sort of the creation of room in between the different parts of the poem, and what Lakshmi is describing about not attunement. Sorry, I have to think of a different word now. But is describing as something that is fundamentally non-linguistic. So that was just an interesting, and also his need to and sort of the idea of overhearing rather than hearing, and practicing, sort of practicing his relationships with these creatures in the in the dark, away from people. So there's just sort of this sense of, and your emphasis on opacity, like there's something really, really interesting in there about things not being readily available to language, things being sort of subsurface, subterranean. Anyway, that's a moment of joy that I got in the connection between your works.
Yeah, and actually, Glissant kind of showed up in sort of all my research, and this idea of the poetics as being an alternative to a kind of language that sort of explains or tries to like to fix things, and yeah, so I really appreciated that from your presentation.
Thank you both. Thank you, Kate and Lakshmi. And something that I picked up in your presentation, Lakshmi, that spoke to me, and I felt like a connection, was when you were talking about this word ma, or prefix rather. Is it a prefix or a syllable?
Yeah, it's a prefix, it's a syllable. It's also in a term on its own as well, but yeah.
A standalone word, and how it conveys a space of betweenness that's also a kind of space of relationality, that beyond ideas of containment, and that felt really fruitful. That felt like a moment where language was actually serving a function that wasn't about kind of fixing or separating, and perhaps the particular sequencing of those ma terms as well, and the speaking of them, the saying of them, the kind of ritualizing of them. So does it feel like language is also, does potentially have a more kind of affirmative role to play in the work that you're doing in that sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, in this one specifically, and it's something that I discovered through the practice. I mean, I guess Japanese has a different relationship to language, and both Mari and another woman that I worked with, who worked with Noguchi, talked about the Japanese language and the characters having an embodied quality and embodied resonance as a nuance to each character word and also sound. So perhaps English has that as well, but we're so separated from it, whereas in Japanese, it's still part of their language and culture. So that was something kind of that was opening for me.
Thank you. Now, I do see that there is a question from Dana. I wonder if and it's a lovely question, Dana, but I'm wondering if somebody else would like to slide in there first. Natalie, did you want to unmute or shall I read your question? I'll read it. Natalie Wood writes, I'm curious about the practice of fugitivity in all your presentations, but in particular, I think you mean Rachel's scholarship. Can you speak more on that and its relation to the truth or knowledge under emotion when Robertson asked his mother about rape?
Fugitivity. Okay, so that wasn't a term that I used specifically. So I can kind of interpret what I think that that you might mean by that question. So fugitivity in the sense of material or experience that's falling kind of outside of certain frameworks, or yeah, it might be helpful to have a bit more clarification on that. I think to kind of speak more generally to what I've been thinking about in relation to Robeson and in relation to the project as a whole, I guess part of what I'm interested in is how certain kinds of feeling might become available, like feelings that are perhaps present but can't be recognized or articulated or given space or importance for whatever reason. And so in a way it kind of, there's an obvious kind of like surface and depth model at play there, this idea of what resides in the depths, or in the subconscious even, that could potentially be brought to light. But I suppose the notion that there is something to be found and there's something to be brought to light, that the kind of the work of poetry can help to bring into view, or to bring into more of a state of kind of conscious feeling and articulation. So I suppose, I don't know if that answers the question at all, but it's perhaps what certainly is kind of lurking for me in my thinking.
Carlota.
I'll speak a little bit to that because I did end with this sort of idea of arrancando, of escaping. And I think that, I think that this sort of model of sovereignty that I would propose as the sort of counter to this, Leviathan-like sovereignty has a lot to do with ideas of fugitivity, with the undercommons, with Moten and Harvey's undercommons, as a kind of that it's both the decision and the exception. So it's both the deciding force and also the exception on which it is deciding. So it's constituted not through the sort of separation of those moments or the aboveness and belowness of those moments, but through and then through, the idea of a sovereign or of a commons in general sort of implies a certain kind of fixed constitution. But the idea of the undercommons or these fugitivities is that you're always undercutting the constitution of the thing that you're also simultaneously working within. And I think that maybe is a watery property that helps us to think about, that's sort of a general watery property that we can use to think about these political theories, is what I would say.
Thank you. Dana, I'll ask her question then. Rachel, can you say more about why you think Robeson saw the creatures in the aquarium as workers? Is it a sense of common oppression or a more universal experience? And do you think the water mediated that in some way or is significant in it?
Yeah, great question. So the title of the sequence of aquarium poems is called Aquarium Works, and it's thinking about the concept of work partly through various different meanings of working in terms of being a worker, of being at work. So Robeson was working at the aquarium for as part of his employment, while also being a poet, but also thinking about work in terms of what is working, what is operative, what is alive or functioning, rather than what is perhaps dead or inoperative. And so the first poem in the sequence sort of sets up in a way the kind of the argument that maybe that's putting it too strongly, but kind of one of the main ideas of the sequence. And the first poem begins, "These are work poems about work. The animals are the work on display." And then it sort of goes on to say, I am the worker, I am the tank diver. Sort of moved from quotation to paraphrase there. So I think that what's being set up very clearly, and the word work in that first poem is quite a short poem, it's repeated like 5 times within the first 5 or 6 lines, is this kind of insistence that this is the context, this is the presiding condition, that the speaker is at work, that these animals, as Robeson speaker understands them, are also workers, they're co-workers, they're performing acts of labor for the kind of benefit of people who are coming to the aquarium. And I think there's a kind of almost a refusal to distinguish between the aquarium animals and the human workers in a way that is about kind of aligning them within this structure that is a very kind of commercial and in some ways quite a kind of oppressive structure, in which things are being kind of worked hard and in some cases worked to death, well, the deaths of certain animals. But at the same time, I guess there's also this awareness that there's an imbalance in power relations too. That the human workers have power over the animals, and so there's a kind of reckoning with that division of power as well throughout the sequence. So I'd say, yeah, it's a kind of it's a very kind of fruitful thinking about that throughout the sequence.
Thank you. I wonder if there are any, I can't actually see, I'm wondering if there are any questions in the room in Bristol.
I do have a question.
Let me turn the camera around.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I have a question for Rachel. Which is to talk about care. And I wonder exactly what you mean by that. Are there different types of care going on here?
Yeah. So care is Robeson's term. So first in that article, the poet Man's Tank at Aquazoo, talking about feeding and caring, and that kind of conjunction, feeding and caring, becomes a kind of refrain of the sequence of poems as well. It talks about feeding and caring. And I think, there's a kind of practical sort of descriptions of care that are occurring in the sort of looking after the animals, the sort of tending to them that is being described. But interestingly, care takes these quite kind of unusual forms as well, and the speaker often seems to be reflecting on himself as caring in a way that seems unconventional. So for an example of that is there's a poem where the tankman, so Robeson kind of reflecting on his experiences as a tankman, comes into a tank of it's an anaconda tank, and an anaconda has given birth, and all of these tiny little baby snakes have been born in the water, but they're sort of wrapped in like what looks like plastic, like he talks about them as looking like sweet wrappers. And so he realizes that if he doesn't fish them out with a coat hanger and remove that wrapping, that they'll die. And so he says something along the lines of, I midwife the anaconda, I've become a father to 50 babies or something like that. And so there's really kind of just the sort of feminized description of care, or a kind of interestingly strange and unusual description of what's happening there. And equally this reference to my baby when talking about, you know, this kind of looking after a lungfish, you know, not the most kind of cute looking species, and using this kind of terminology that's evoking this kind of caring, like caregiving for a child, or someone, you know, much more kind of vulnerable than oneself. So I think I think that's a kind of constant reflection about the kind of forms that care can take in this text. But I think there's also this kind of backdrop of the aquarium itself as not being a caring infrastructure, and that the actual kind of fellow workers are often characterized in quite kind of unsentimental terms in relation to how they treat the animals. Thanks.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. I'm wondering how, that's why you asked this, but it's the thought that comes to me, which is whether that kind of maternal kind of care in this sort of context is particularly strong. I think you said this in the 1960s, right?
Yeah, 1968 and onwards,
Yeah, so certainly my understanding of kind of the history of zoos is that between the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a string actually of male zookeepers who were quite prominent in the media, who present themselves in these really maternal ways. And I'm not sure that's happening before. I'm not sure it's happened since, and I'm wondering if there's something specific around what's going on at that time.
I mean, look, the 60s as being the kind of rise of conservation movement and environmentalism, and so perhaps there's a kind of shift in tone and a shift in kind of understanding of how we relate to captive animals, potentially. But that does seem like a quite kind of specific phenomenon, and I'd like to look into that more and see if there's a kind of trend. I can see, Fran, that you have a question, but I'm also very conscious of time, and I don't know. Okay.
We're at time, but I do want to give a little bit of space to Frederick Needle's comment, which I think is a really lovely place to end, because it does connect again all three presentations. Frederick writes, love the emphasis on embodied engaged work over considering, inspecting, watching, echoes recent rediscoveries of Georgic themes in nature writing and poetry, working to destabilize romantic notions of an ideal pristine nature. Amazing to see how early Robeson was tangling with these ideas. I see. I think that's a wonderful observation. I also think that Lakshmi's emphasis on the practice-based quality of sort of developing this understanding of oneself as water, as a bag of water, that it cannot be separated from the actual physical engagement with that state of being. And I think Carlota, rather than let me formulate it, is going to say it herself.
I loved when you said this is not about forming an ecological consciousness, and I think that speaks to Frederick's comment as well. That's not the paradigm that we're thinking with here. So I thought that was very helpful. Thank you.
But Carlota, I also really love the sense that the way that the perpetually processual goddess-like quality of the water refuses to be it cannot be tied down to a particular moment of its utterance, and it can't be viewed from above. It is inevitably and always processual. So thank you all so much for a really lovely seminar. I thoroughly enjoyed the individual presentations, and I also really enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to our final seminar in the series. I have promptly forgotten what day it is, but it is on thinking globally and locally with plants. And Sam Labutt will be chairing that, and our speakers are Franklin and Oriana and Trisha Wood. So I look forward to seeing you then, and enjoy your afternoon or evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kate, and everybody for your presentations and for this opportunity.
Bye, everybody. And Rachel, I'm so sorry I forgot your name, but
I enjoyed both of your presentations so much. Thank you. Yeah.